Dr. Lisa Greenwood is an assistant professor in environmental health and safety management at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She has more than 20 years' experience in environmental and occupational health and safety management. Her teaching and research interests includes EHS management systems integration and implementation, environmental sustainability, corporate social responsibility, consensus-based standards development, and thinking in systems. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you. This presentation discusses the challenges that small and medium enterprises face in establishing and implementing an internal audit program, with some particular focus on auditor independence, objectivity, and impartiality. So I'll explore the potential of a guided audit approach for internal environmental management system audits as a means to enhance auditor independence, objectivity, and competence as well. So the main gist of the presentation is that ISO management system standards require organizations to conduct internal audits, and further they include requirements related to auditor selection. But those requirements can pose a challenge for smaller organizations due to the barriers and challenges that they face related to resources and capabilities. So I'll discuss first the relevant requirements and challenges for small and medium enterprises, and follow that with a review of general approaches for internal audits that are typically used and their advantages and disadvantages, and then a discussion of a guided audit approach for internal auditing that's been applied in working with some local small and medium enterprises and the results that we achieved with that. So first, let's start with some context and background in relation to ISO requirements using ISO 14001 as the basis for the discussion, followed by a discussion of particular challenges that small and medium enterprises face with environmental management system implementation and auditing. So ISO 14001 sets out general requirements for organizations regarding internal audits, as well as requirements for an internal audit program. Under the general requirements, an organization has to carry out internal audits at planned intervals for the purpose of evaluating whether the organization meets the requirements of the ISO 14001 standard, as well as its own internal or additional requirements for its environmental management system, and whether or not its EMS is implemented and maintained in an effective manner. So before we discuss these requirements further, let's have a look at how the terms are defined. ISO defines an audit as a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. So audit criteria consist of internal and external policies, procedures, processes, rules, or requirements that the organization follows or has to follow. And the audit involves comparing these against the audit evidence to evaluate conformity. So an organization has to look at the evidence in relation to the criteria that need to be met and determine the status of the environmental management system. So as noted in the definition of internal audit, an internal audit can be conducted by the organization itself or by an external party on its behalf. So an organization could conduct its own internal audit using its own staff and employees as auditors, and alternatively, it could make an arrangement with an external party whereby the external party would act on behalf of the organization to conduct the internal audit. The requirements in the standard state that the organization has to put a program in place for auditing the environmental management system, which includes which audits need to be done, when, by whom, the methods to be used, and the program has to address responsibilities of personnel in relation to the audit program and planning requirements related to the audit program. So responsibilities for those conducting and reporting on audits need to be specified and communicated, whether the auditors are internal or external. As part of identifying responsibilities and planning requirements for the internal audit program, an organization has to select auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process. And guidance in ISO 19011 suggests that auditor independence can be demonstrated by freedom from responsibility for the activity being audited and freedom from bias and conflict of interest. In smaller organizations, it may not really be possible for internal or in-house auditors to be fully independent of the activity being audited. For example, in smaller organizations, employees often take on diverse responsibilities and end up wearing multiple hats. But this shouldn't mean that a smaller organization can't conduct its own internal audit. In this case, the organization would need to make and demonstrate a substantial effort to remove bias and encourage objectivity. And auditors should be objective throughout the process and ensure that the findings and conclusions of the audit are based, solely on the audit evidence. The Institute of Internal Auditors describes objectivity as an unbiased mental attitude that allows internal auditors to perform their work such that they can believe in their work product and its quality. And it's important that internal auditors don't subordinate their judgment on audit matters to others. So this ties in with auditor competence, which is an important factor for small and medium enterprises as well. While not explicitly required by ISO 14001, ISO 19011 indicates that the planning requirements for the audit program should include considerations for auditor competence as well, in order to provide confidence regarding the reliability that can be placed on the audit results. So auditors should be competent based on training, education, or experience, having the necessary knowledge or skills and ability to apply the appropriate personal behaviors to achieve the intended results of the audit. So this includes generic knowledge and skills, but also discipline and sector-specific knowledge and skills. And in small and medium enterprises, it's quite likely that the most competent person to conduct an internal audit of the environmental management system is also the person primarily responsible for establishing it and overseeing its implementation. So that leads us into the barriers or challenges that small and medium enterprises face with regard to environmental management system implementation in general, and more specifically, the internal audit process. So let's be clear on small and medium enterprises as a concept or a category. SMEs it's a broad category defined as independent firms that employ less than 250 employees with either an annual balance sheet that doesn't exceed 43 million euros or annual turnover that doesn't exceed 50 million euros. While that categorization is based on the number of employees a firm has, as well as their financial assets, the staff headcount is the main component of the categorization, and there are separate designations for small and medium enterprises. Small firms are considered to be those with fewer than 50 employees, and micro enterprises are those with fewer than 10 employees. And what's shown here is based on the European Union definition, since that's what's most typically applied in ISO's literature on environmental management systems and in academic literature as well. But the definitions and criteria do differ regionally. And for example, in the US, SMEs typically include firms with fewer than 500 employees, but that threshold varies based on the industry sector. So that's important to keep in mind. Research on small and medium enterprises suggests that they represent more than 95% of employer businesses and are collectively responsible for roughly 70% of pollution impacts. So smaller organizations may have smaller individual environmental footprints compared to that of a larger firm, but they represent a significant portion of the industrial sector and are thus collectively responsible for a major portion of the overall global environmental burden. While there are a number of contributing motivations for smaller firm EMS implementation, the main driver for ISO 14001 implementation and certification anyway appears to be pressure from customers and business partners. And based on analysis of the ISO 14001 user survey that was conducted in 2013, this was the main motivation for close to 70% of the small and medium enterprises who participated in the survey, and it was a contributing factor for others as well. In cases where small and medium enterprises are under pressure to adopt ISO 14001 in order to gain or maintain a business relationship, research suggests that the resulting EMS may not necessarily become internalized within the organization, and that has some implications for the effectiveness of the EMS and also for environmental performance. Many of the challenges for uptake of ISO 14001 in small and medium enterprises are similar to those experienced by larger organizations, but research suggests that these can be considerably magnified as the size of the organization decreases. Resource constraints, costs associated with certification can pose problems for any organization, but in smaller organizations, they can really be prohibitive. Costs associated with the initial implementation and certification have been estimated from $20,000 to $50,000 US dollars, and potentially higher in smaller organizations. And that may only partially account for the resources required to support implementation. Outsourcing of the audit function to a well-qualified auditing firm can come with a pretty high price tag, so that would only add to the cost for smaller organizations. In terms of support, there may be limited support or guidance from management, limited employee engagement in the environmental management system overall, depending on the motivations that the organization had for adopting ISO 14001 and other factors. But that can mean limited support for planning and involvement in internal audits as well. Time constraints exist in terms of time required to plan and prepare for internal audits, time to carry out the auditing itself, and time for evaluating and reporting on the results. And that can compete with production schedules and other responsibilities, putting strain on staffing resources. Smaller organizations are more likely to have environmental management responsibilities assigned to employees with other primary responsibilities, and environmental improvement efforts, including internal auditing of the EMS, could easily be interrupted or downgraded in priority. And environmental management system capabilities are a major factor in that employees may lack the technical expertise needed in environmental management, as well as competence in management system auditing. And where environmental management is part of their responsibilities, it has to compete with other priorities. So several strategies and internal auditing practices have been applied that can help a small or medium enterprise in overcoming some of the challenges that they face. As noted in ISO's definition of internal audit, internal audit can be conducted by the organization itself or by an external party on its behalf, as I mentioned earlier. So I'll just discuss three general approaches here, namely first-party audits, second-party audits, and co-sourced audits as options for internal auditing. So in the case of a first-party audit, the organization conducts its own internal audit using in-house auditors, namely employees or staff. And a first-party audit allows management to have full control over the audit and the internal audit schedule. And in-house auditors would have strong knowledge of the organization's structure and context. In-house auditors would be familiar with the systems and programs in place, as well as any existing concerns, and may be able to audit in more depth as a result. And over time, that can even provide for some consistency and identification of ongoing issues that maybe it's a small issue, an opportunity for improvement, but over time, may need to be elevated to a nonconformity. And on the other hand, an in-house auditor may not have the competence in auditing or expertise in the subject matter. So competence is dependent on the training, education, experience, and the quality of that. And in-house auditors may not be fully independent of what's being audited, may be difficult for them to be fully objective. One strategy to address those issues could involve training employees who aren't directly responsible for the EMS about the basics of auditing and what ISO 14001 requires. But time, staffing, and financial constraints can ultimately limit the extent of the training that's provided for in-house auditors in smaller organizations. First-party audits will also require a significant time commitment for planning, conducting, and reporting on the results of internal audits. However, there are some advantages to scheduling audits of various elements of the EMS at appropriate intervals, such that the entire management system does not have to be audited all at once. A second-party internal audit involves contracting with a qualified external party to conduct the organization's internal audits, and that provides for freedom from responsibility for the activity being audited, a high degree of expertise in environmental management, in ISO 14001 requirements, and management system auditing, as well as a fresh look at the status of the EMS. And in addition, that can reduce the time commitment for at least some of the in-house personnel in relation to the audit. But on the other hand, the cost can be very high. The auditors may not have extensive process, sector, or organizational knowledge, and they're really looking at a snapshot of the management system to some extent, so may not be able to audit to the same depth as an in-house auditor. Depending on the extent of involvement of in-house personnel, a second-party audit may not really go far to enhance the internal capabilities of in-house auditors relative to the management system and internal auditing. And further, due to cost and scheduling factors, a second-party audit is probably more likely to be structured as like an all-at-once approach that could lead to audit fatigue among employees and staff. So that brings me to the idea of a co-sourced internal audit. And the co-sourced approach is one where one or more in-house auditors would work with an external provider to conduct the internal audits of the EMS. And this practice has been utilized in financial audits. Not sure the extent to which it's been employed in terms of environmental management system audits, but it can be considered as a hybrid approach, offers the best of both worlds to some extent. So the co-sourced approach would allow the internal auditing team to maintain control of their program while receiving some assistance from external providers in areas where they lack the necessary competencies or capabilities. And that would help them to improve their internal capabilities, as well as reducing the cost in comparison with a fully outsourced second-party audit. So the potential benefits of a co-source audit merit some consideration as an option for small and medium enterprises. So in order to explore co-sourcing as an option and benefits for small and medium enterprises, an internal EMS audit learning process was developed and administered by faculty at RIT with environmental management and environmental management system auditing expertise in cooperation with the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute and 2 small local facilities to pilot the project. So the process included elements of training and application of knowledge as a means to enhance internal audit capabilities, and the use of an audit checklist and guide that accompany the checklist to conduct internal audits of specific elements of the environmental management system. The learning process took place over the course of 12 hours for each of the sites that we worked with, and included an acting audit manager as well as a technician who would be responsible for performing the internal audits. And the training portion of the process included training on ISO 14001 requirements with emphasis on internal audit requirements, and review of the environmental management system audit checklist and guide that was developed at RIT. And then following that, in-house auditors participated in an auditing workshop of sorts, in which they could use the checklist and apply the guidance provided, as well as the knowledge that they gained from the training session to actually conduct an audit of selected elements of the environmental management system. And the checklist addressed all of ISO 14001's requirements and included explanations that clarified the intent of the requirements and examples of documentation and other practices that could serve as evidence of conformity with various requirements. And in-house auditors had the opportunity to ask questions throughout the process to get clarification and in order to enhance their understanding of ISO 14001's requirements as well as the auditing requirements. The guided audit portion of the learning process was tailored specifically to the competencies of that the individual participants had coming in prior to the learning process. So that improved the effectiveness of the learning process by focusing the guided portion of the audit on existing knowledge gaps first. For example, in one organization, the auditing manager had fairly extensive experience with quality management system auditing. So the main focus was on the elements of ISO 14001 that had more environmental discipline-specific requirements. So here's a look at our at least preliminary results. Participants were asked to evaluate their capabilities in a number of areas related to the internal audit, both before the learning process and following the learning process. And that included their level of confidence or degree of confidence relative to the ISO 14001 requirements, objectives of environmental management system internal audits, components of an internal audit program, how to look for audit evidence in relation to audit criteria, and audit documentation and reporting. And the red bars on the chart indicate overall confidence in capabilities prior to the learning process, and the orange bars indicate results after completion of the learning process. So each pair of bars represents one individual participant's responses. So while this was a pilot project and the sample was small, all of the participants indicated they had gained confidence in their overall capabilities in internal auditing of the EMS in varying degrees, consistent with different levels of knowledge and skill that they had prior to the learning process. The results suggest that a guided approach can offer value for small and medium enterprises through enhancing their internal capabilities in relation to environmental management systems and management system auditing. So while this was just a pilot project for the approach, so more research is needed to expand the sample and also to investigate further the elements of the guided approach that may be of particular value. So for example, from the results, it isn't clear about the extent to which the checklist itself offered value in comparison with the use of a guided approach in applying the checklist. And future research would maybe need to consider the extent to which the value of the approach and its components depended on contextual factors in the organization, so including the existing in-house expertise. In review, an organization can perform its audits purely internally using in-house staff and employees, or it could bring in external auditors. And there are some potential benefits and drawbacks for each. But in the end, an organization can consider its human and technical resources. Do they have adequate competency to carry out all the necessary areas of the audit? They can consider financial resources. So is it cost effective to carry out all aspects of the audit in-house? And also consider its time-based resources. So do they have the time available for in-house auditing and reporting? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, then perhaps a fully in-house audit could be a viable and effective option. If the answer to all of those questions is no, then perhaps they should look to outsource the audit entirely to a second party. But if the results are somewhere in between, a co-sourced guided approach can reduce the cost of an outsourced audit while helping the organization to develop its internal capabilities. Not only does the approach promote learning regarding the internal audit process, it can develop employee engagement, competence in environmental management, and competence in environmental management system implementation. So this enhancement of competence and capabilities could lead to continual improvement of the management system and its efficiency, and ultimately could enhance environmental performance. So in our case, the learning process was funded in large part by the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute and RIT. So the clients were only responsible for a small percentage of the cost. So if low or no cost avenues for external support were available, I think this would go much further to make co-sourcing or guided audits a viable way of developing internal auditor competencies, while limiting the financial impacts that would be associated typically with a second party audit. So thank you. That concludes my presentation. I do have a list of resources provided here for reference. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. This ends today's presentation. Have a great day.